All right. So before I get started, I do just want to quickly just touch one more thing here on the Enterprise 11. So Enterprise 11.0 is actually currently out right now. So, but we tend to we recommend, Esri recommends that most folks wait in their production environment to the .1 release, and it's the .1 release that isn't going to come out until early next year. So again, we want to deploy 11 ourselves. We want to work with it, and then we'll have that webinar when it's closer to the time when all of you will be upgrading potentially to that. So now into the subject matter here. So today's webinar is essentially a part 2. So in the last utility network webinar, we focused on the characteristics of the utility network. So we highlighted some schema differences between the geometric network and the utility network. We looked at some planning considerations and various tools. We went through a data migration example. We talked about Esri's asset package and how to move your data into that asset package. Then we went on to stage the utility network, creating the structure layers. We applied the asset package, and we finally published a feature service that we could work with. And that's kind of where we ended. So this webinar is going to assume that you already know a good deal about the utility network and that perhaps you're currently working with the utility network. So we'll go on here for our agenda. So basically what I want to do is just kind of take a look at the utility network toolbar. So I'm going to kind of be switching back and forth here between this PowerPoint presentation and actually Arc Pro. So any of you that have worked with Pro know that sometimes it doesn't like to cooperate, which is why I did some of my examples I have recorded. For one, technology is not always reliable. For two, some of the processes are quite long, so we don't really have the time to sit through those. So going on to the network toolbar, we'll look at topology and dirty areas. We'll touch on terminal connections. We'll talk about associations and modifying associations. We'll look at what are subnetworks and how would you go about creating a subnetwork. Finally, we'll kind of look at tracing and trace configurations and looking at how we can use those trace configurations in the new Experience Builder Trace widget. So again, the utility network, it's the framework for the real world modeling of various utility systems, gas, water, electric, and wastewater. And again, we're going to focus on, like I said, the toolbar covering subnetworks, associations, terminal connections, etc. So let's jump right into the toolbar. And so I'm going to end the slideshow for a second. And now here we are in Pro, and this is my utility network. So this is an actual utility network. We're not using the Naperville data here. So I am going to, before we go into, this is the network toolbar up here. And before I get into a lot of detail on the different tools, we're going to go ahead and see how you can view your utility network's properties by right-clicking on your utility network, going to properties, and then here we have our network properties. And a lot of what's in here is very similar to the data dictionary, the difference being that this is your network. So a lot of the rules, if you use the asset package, are going to be the same. But if you've added any customizations, modified any rules, you're going to see those in here. And so you have some just basic information, what release you're on, Pro 2.9, last modified, whether the topology is enabled or not, and any errors that I may have. Going into our structure network, we can see here what we have for structure junctions. We can look in further and go through our different layers, the lines, the boundaries, the non-spatial objects. So the rules, so this is where you can see all your rules. Unfortunately, there is not a great way to filter through these as of yet. So there's thousands of rules in the utility network. And unless you've memorized the ID of all these rules, you're going to have to look through them like this. And then you can scroll over, take a look at all of the different kind of attributes. You can see the terminals that are associated with them, to asset, from asset, And this is just really helpful if you're trying to figure out, especially if you're getting errors in anything. I think when you first come into a utility network, I know that when I first came into a utility network, I had tons of errors, and a lot of them came around things that I had connected that weren't allowed to be connected. So this is where you can go in and kind of see what is currently allowed and see if maybe you need to go and modify those. Then we get into like the attributes and the assignments. So tier rank and shape length. And then these attributes, these network attributes are used in tracing. So, and you can use those to set barriers. And we'll look at that in a little bit here. So again, the terminal configurations, pressure reducing, pressure increasing. We'll go through an example that I have when I am creating an association that inadvertently creates an error surrounding terminal connections, and we'll use this terminal connections tool to basically modify that. Network diagrams, these just show the basic. In any network, if you created your own network diagram, you're going to see that in here. So I like to have a couple different maps here in my project. So the sewer utility network map is basically my client server connection. This is my connection into the database here. So there are a number of tools in the utility network where you're going to have to do that with that database connection. So if we go into our toolbox, and this isn't always 100% true, but a kind of a good rule of thumb is tools under this administration toolbox here are tools, generally speaking, where you're going to want to do it on the database connection and not on the service connection. So for most of these, what we'll go in and do, for example, if you were going to add a rule or a tier or delete a rule or any of these, export rules and associations, you would go in and stop your utility network service, and then you'd go ahead and disable your network topology. And then you could come over here to this database connection and work with your tools. So this export subnetwork, it's out of the administration toolbox, but it is also one that you're going to need to do on the database side. So then we can get into this one, and this is my connection into the service itself. And then there are things that you're going to do on the service. So updating is connected and updating subnetwork. Those are things that you'll do quite a bit. So you'll update the subnetwork when you're creating a new subnetwork. So when you first come in, you're not going to have, if you're creating this from scratch or coming from the geometric network, you're not going to have a subnetwork. So at the very minimum, you're going to need to have at least one subnetwork for tracing. And so those were all, it was kind of a learning process for me as I came into this, as to, I went right away and tried to trace. And of course I didn't. And this is where we'll get into it a little bit further as to what are these tiers. And then, for example, in the sewer network, we have, various tiers. We have cathodic protection, we have sewer sheds, and then we have that sewer collection system. And so that sewer collection system, at the very minimum, I needed just one subnetwork for that sewer collection system. And then I was able to trace. The example today is going to be showing, and this is just a little preview of that, how you would create, these are some different sewer sheds that I created, and we'll go through a demo video of how you would do that. But you'd also use the update subnetwork when you're adding new features. So if you add a new feature in, it doesn't have, there's various attributes, and we can zoom in and take a look at that real quick, provided that Pro wants to cooperate. So we'll go ahead and take a look at, so let's turn that off. There we go. Take a look at the attributes here. So in the attributes, so here we have one called is connected. So when you create new features, this is not going to be set to true. You'll need to run that is connected as you go through editing your network. And then this is where you have the system subnetwork. So this is the system that's my collection system. So this is basically, I named that subnetwork collection. So when you create a new feature off of here, it's not going to have that name in there. So And that's important in traces. You're going to want this to have the most up-to-date information. So you will want to run that update subnetwork tool in there. And then tracing, these are all done by validating your network topology. That's all done on the service end. So we'll zoom back out here and quickly touch on the toolbar here. Oops. There we go. We'll zoom back in. So up here, Utility Network Toolbar, I'll click on it. And so in this first section here, I have my network topology, and that's where I'm going to validate the current extent or the entire extent. And this is where we're going to see things called dirty areas. And you can see that down here under the dirty areas section. So those are used as a visual marker to detect where edits to features have taken place that basically require incorporation into the network topology. So they're created when an edit is made to geometry or to terminal configurations, associations, subtypes, or network attributes. They're also created for error features. So they're also created during your reconcile and posting if you have different versions. So when you just do a simple edit, you'll notice if you've edited any of those things that I just mentioned, it'll look like this. And then when you validate topology, it'll either go away or you'll see an error, in which case you can use the error inspector, and which is nice. That'll inspect, bring up all the errors within your view extent. Then we'll take a look at these terminal connections. So terminals are basically logical points on devices that represent flow in or out of the given asset. So they allow you to basically establish flow paths. So in the instance of pumps, which is where I ended up finding a lot of my errors, you can either be high pressure in or low pressure out. And again, if you're wondering what the terminals are on various devices, you can see that in your network properties. And then for directional manhole channels, you'll have things like upstream, downstream. So a lot of the errors that come about on that is that until you have set that, it sees more than one possibility. So we'll see an example of that here coming up. Next, we have our association pane. And so this is where we'll go ahead and we'll add associations, entering containment, that is for containment associations, and whether or not we display what we want to display within that content. And that's based on display filters. And then this view up here, which was also kind of confusing because as you hover over it, it says turn view associations mode off and on, but what it doesn't really tell you, gives you a clue with the picture here, is that this is specifically for connectivity association. So for those junction connectivity. So if you click this, if you've drawn a container and you click this and you think you're going to see something, you won't. These are only if you've created associations between 2 points, and we'll see an example of that later. So this is our trace panel here. And so we can set starting points and barriers and clear those. We have a variety of different traces. So connected, subnetwork controller. We can see there's a loops trace, isolation traces that would be good for probably electric and water, upstream, downstream traces, etc. And this is the diagram section. So we're not going to we don't have time to go over diagrams today. That could be a part 3. And I haven't even had a chance to take a deep dive into all the functionality of diagrams. So look out for kind of a part 3 on the utility network that focuses on diagrams. And then here's our subnetwork. So we can find our subnetwork, and if it's dirty, so when I defined my subnetworks, when I set my subnetwork definition, I decided to have it monitor whether it was dirty or not. So these are my different subnetworks that I have. This is my collection subnetwork, and here it tells me what tier it's on. So it's on the sewer collection system tier. And then I have 3 sewer sheds on the sewer shed tier. Now, if I go to, you can update the subnetwork through the geoprocessing tools, or you can see it's grayed out here because I don't have, it's not dirty. So if I were to click on this sewer collection one, I could go ahead and update the subnetwork from here. So always more than one way to do things. This modify controller, so you're going to use this to set the subnetwork controller. And again, by going back to your properties, you can find out what's considered a subnetwork controller. So you can modify those, but if you've started with the asset package, Esri's kind of defined what, industry standards for what they feel that certain subnetwork controllers are. So in the instance of my sewer sheds, directional manhole channels are a subnetwork controller. I can't just go at this point and grab any other device and say I want it to be a subnetwork controller, not with going through creating and modifying what can be a subnetwork controller. So that's kind of an important thing to go through and to understand. So now we're going to jump back into the PowerPoint here. So we will go ahead and minimize that. So now let's just take a look at associations. So basically associations are logical connections that maintain the network connectivity in the absence of them actually being physically connected, or geometric coincidence of features. So we have three different types of associations: connectivity, containment, and structural. We touched a little bit on these two. So the connectivity associations between two features that aren't necessarily coincidence, and that would be a junction to junction. So an example would be a transformer to a distribution line, or in the example of our sewer network, a pipe connection to a manhole channel. So in that case, we can have a manhole channel and our pipe connection's not sitting on top of it. It's sitting next to it so that you can visualize it. And then we use these connectivity associations to establish that connection. And I have an example of both connectivity associations, creating those, and containment. So containment allows for features, a collection of features, to basically be represented as a single point, helps to declutter the map. So it's used to model the association between content and container features. And again, there are certain features that are allowed to be containers. So as you customize your utility network, keep that in mind, that if you're using the asset package, it's a starting point. So if you have added, say, a different asset type or an asset type that wasn't there, and it is part of a subtype that can be a container, you actually have to go in through the geoprocessing tools and say that your new customized asset type is allowed to be a container. Otherwise, you won't be able to go into containment and set that. So it can be a polygon, a point, or a line. And so an example would be a sewer main and casing, or a lift station, which would contain a pump. Structural associations basically model the association between structural and the domain network. So the domain feature is attached. So transformer bank to a power pole would be an example there. So let's take a look at an example of a containment association. So I'm going to play this, and I'll probably fast forward a little bit through it just because it does get a little bit slow. But basically what we're going to be doing is creating a lift station boundary, and we're going to be containing a pump and a wet well and a valve. So kind of what I wanted to demonstrate in this portion was so basically when you're using the asset package and you come through, you get a collection of these pro maps, and then you associate your own I'm going to pause this here. You basically hook up your own data to it. Well, it's not always perfect. So in this example, for some reason, this lift station boundary did not, the template that was set up for it did not have lift station as the default for every time you create an asset. And instead it was unknown. And so the problem I ran into is that I kept trying to draw this and go into containment mode, and it kept telling me that there was no feature that was allowed to go into containment. And that's because unknowns are not they're not seen as features that can go into containment. It has to have be either like a storm vault or a lift station or a treatment plant. So basically what we can do in your map, if you do have this instance where this is saying unknown. You can either change it each time, or you can go and manage your templates in here. And then we'll fast forward through this a little bit more. Once you click on that, you go to properties, and then you would go over to attributes, and then see it says unknown for the default there. So you could go ahead and just grab the drop down, change it to lift station, click OK. And then the next time you go to draw in your features, you don't have to worry about remembering to change that. So again, we'll fast forward a little bit through here because we're just going to redraw the feature. And then it says lift station, so we're good. We're going to clear a lot of saving in here because I am actually working in a version, which I do recommend. If you don't work in a version, then all your changes are immediately applied. So we're going to go to the associations panel, and we're going to enter containment. And there's a variety of different ways. I mean, you can associate things through the modify tool. You can do that. But the nice thing about going into containment is that everything that you place inside of this blue perimeter is going to automatically be associated. So we'll take a look at that. We're going to just start creating some features. So we're going to create a valve. So we're going to grab that, and I'll kind of try to go through this a little bit more. So we'll do a valve, and then we're going to draw some pipes that are going to connect us to our pump. So we're adding our pump in there, and then we need to connect that out to our manhole channel. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add this wet well, but this wet well is not going to be on top of the point. We want to still be able to see it. So we're going to zoom in really close, and we're going to drop that wet well very close to the pump. And our goal for this is that all of these things are contained inside of the lift station boundary. And then also beyond that, the pump is contained inside of the wet well. So we're going to go here, and we're going to drop our wet well. Again, zooming out, saving our features, validating topology often, save, validate. Those are our main things that we want to make sure that we're always doing. So we're going to exit containment now, and then we're going to use this modify tool up top here just to take a look at some of the properties. And then we're also going to want to contain the pump inside of the vault. So if we click on that, we open up the modify associations pane. I'm going to pause this real quick. So it's right now it's telling us I clicked on the lift station boundary, and it's telling me that it has 5 things that are in containment here. So we have the storm sewer vault, the force main, pumps, the gravity main, and the controllable valve. And we'll see a little bit about the display filters later. So the display filters were another thing that reset themselves. So in the Naperville example, if you're using their data and you go ahead and you display content up here, everything works like it's supposed to. If you replace your data into that map, there is a good chance that those display filters that were making the Naperville example work are no longer set. And if they're not set correctly, then when you go to display and hide content, it's not going to do anything at all. So we'll look at how you can go back and kind of remedy that situation, because that happened to me and I couldn't figure out why I wasn't able to hide the content like I was supposed to be able to. But just to explain this visible column here, basically, if you check it, it ignores the display content. So we're going to hide, a number of things, but if we check that box, then that's still going to be visible. So I'm going to do that because I actually still want to see the storm sewer vault in there. And I'm going to get rid of the force main because I don't necessarily need that to be contained. That's not the point of it, was to see the point features that were inside of that without cluttering the map. So I'm just going to unassociate those. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to click on this wet well, and we can take a look at that. So if I pause we'll let that, click on that again. There we go. So right now it's going to show that it's contained inside of the lift station boundary, which is great, but we want to contain the pump inside of it. So in order to do that, we just click the arrow and we're going to click on the pump. And then now it's in there, and I'm going to leave that box unchecked because I do want to hide that once it's once we display the content or hide the content. I want that to not be visible. So again, then we go saving and validating our topology. And then we'll take a look at the errors here. So when we validated, we mentioned before the terminal configuration. So when we validated that topology, you can see that we have a dirty area, not only, you know, it's symbolized by the purple or blue, depending on the argument. It's like the dress from the internet. Nobody really knows, but purple or blue, but it's also got a red boundary around it. So I know that there's a problem, and I already know that that problem is going to be from the pump. There is more than one junction edge rule that's applicable. So basically, I haven't told it whether or not that pump is high pressure and low pressure out. So the terminals are on the device itself, but you are going to set the terminal configurations on the lines. So we're going to go through and we're going to click the terminal connections, and we're going to go ahead and click lines on pipes on either side. So that's correct. I want that to be low pressure in. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, but I want that to be high pressure out. So as soon as I apply that, I'm going to be able to save and then validate my topology, and I should no longer see any errors. So we'll validate our current extent. And the validation was successful. No more errors. So now you can see that all of the only visible thing in my content right now is what I told to still be visible. And so I want to explain a little bit about these display filters. So if you click on one of the layers up there and you go to appearance, you click on display filters. So what was happening for me is that this was set to scale and there was no display filter there. So when I would click, you know, hide or show, it wasn't doing anything at all. So basically I went back to the Naperville example to look at what their display filters look like, and I copied them. So what you want for the purpose of containment associations is to set it to manual, turn on your SQL, and then that's what you're going to want to paste. And you can just grab that from your Naperville example if you're using that. And so once I set and you would do that on all of your layers. And once you do that, then you'll find that those tools, that works for you. So next, I think we'll stop here on that one. The next thing that I want to show is connectivity associations. So we're going to just start this right now. And so this is our junction connectivity. So we'll go through here and we're just going to add some stuff. It might not be something that you would actually see in real life, but just for the purpose of showing how we can connect 2 points that aren't actually touching each other. Kind of rush through this a little bit. So I'm setting this up to where I'm going to have some connectivity features here. So I'm validating. We'll go through, we'll fast forward this a little bit more. And so then so basically what I'm doing here is I'm associating those two together. So I'm going to click that and I'm going to click on the pipe and I'm associating the pipe with the valve. Again, not sure that would be an actual configuration, but this is, you know, just for purposes of seeing this. And then after we've validated that, we're going to go ahead and display that connectivity. Oh, looks like I'm doing it to a couple other ones here. So let's move forward. Okay, so this is where we're going to click that view, and that's where this is going to come into play. So now you can see it has drawn the lines and it shows that connectivity between them. And then we're even going to see a trace. So we'll validate that. And we will watch. This is going through and I'm updating the subnetwork here because all of these features that I added, they didn't have their subnetwork updated. So we're going through, we're updating the subnetwork because the trace would break, it would stop there if we didn't do that. So Next, after we update the subnetwork, we'll go ahead and see what the trace looks like. So I'm going to just drop a point and you can see how you'll be able to trace right through those connections that aren't actually touching each other. There we go. We've successfully traced through everything. So that is basically our junction-junction connectivity. So fast forwarding here. So subnetworks, we'll really quickly go through what a subnetwork is. So they represent systems like pressure zones or sewer sheds that basically have resources that run through them. So they're the backbone of tracing and network diagrams and allow you to visualize your network. So in this example, this is showing the Naperville sewer sheds. And these are the various things that you can do: visualization, labeling, and map production, tracing. So this was just a really quick demo of how you'd go about creating a subnetwork. So starting here, basically what I did is I was setting the subnetwork. So this is a manhole channel, and currently manhole channels by themselves are the asset type manhole channel needs to be a directional manhole channel in order to be considered a subnetwork controller. So the first thing I needed to do was essentially to change that. So I have made that it's an acceptable subnetwork controller, but I've got some terminals on there. So again, back to our terminals, we're going to see how we have to set those. So we'll click on our terminal connections, and instead of being high pressure and low pressure out, we're going to be looking at upstream, downstream. So this gives us 4 options. It'll give us an upstream 1 and an upstream 2. Now you can see there's our dirty areas in progress. Nothing wrong with it, just telling us that we've edited, and then we'll go ahead and set our downstream, and we'll validate our topology. And then it'll get rid of our errors. And then we're going to set that as the subnetwork controller. So we're clicking on our modify subnetwork controller. And now I'm actually going to give it a name. I'm going to choose my tier, making sure I wanted to put that in the sewer shed tier. I'm going to give it a name for the controller itself. And then I'm going to give the subnetwork a name. And then once we do that, we hit apply. The next step is going to be to then update our subnetwork. So we're updating the subnetwork. Here's our update subnetwork tool. So we're doing this on the service, so not the database connection. We're picking our domain and then the tier that we want to update. So we're going to do the sewer shed. We can do all subnetworks, or if we uncheck that, it'll give us a name of our different subnetworks. So I do that. I'm going to do it on all subnetworks. So we'll run that. And then we won't wait for that. So, and now we have our subnetwork. So we have that, we can see the subnetwork names down there. And then if you click on your subnetworks, basically these are the network attributes that we were talking about. So we have interceptor length, collector length, how many manholes you have in there, how many service connections. So it gives us a lot of valuable data. And that is basically how you would create a subnetwork. So really quick, going into tracing and trace configuration. So I am going to try to be mindful of this. So I'm going to end the slideshow. We're going to take a look at tracing. So I'm just going to do a basic trace. So we'll do our subnetworks. We're going to zoom in here. So one thing that's important too that we'll mention when we look at trace configuration. So I'm going to set a trace location. I'm just going to plot my point here. Let's just do an upstream trace. So it already inputs my network, the type. So I'm going to choose my domain network, which is sewer, and then I can decide what tier. So just for for time's sake, I'm just going to pick my sewer collection system. This validate consistency is something that I do want to go over. So basically with that checked, if you have any dirty areas in your map, your trace is going to stop. And so when we talk about publishing trace configurations, which is what you need to do if you want to take use of the Experience Builder Trace widget, if you have that checked, and you're not constantly validating your topology, and you have this, trace widget in there, and maybe you want, some of your stakeholders to be able to run traces, just be aware that that trace will fail if there's any dirty areas on there. So you can uncheck that, but for validating, making sure you have the most up-to-date information, it's better to leave it checked. So we can get into detail about condition barriers, but these are the basic ones that were set up for you, and you can modify these all you want. So these are some network attributes, and they're basically saying how the trace would stop. So if it's closed, the trace is going to stop. If the life cycle is in service or to be retired, then if it does not equal that, then it's going to stop. So there's various things that can make these stop. These are the defaults. You can add your own. We can even get into more specific things like filtering, looking at different functions. So you can, calculate the sum of shape length. We can determine like how we want the output to be. We can say we only want to see specific features in here. And again, maybe another webinar based just on tracing, but we're going to go ahead and run this trace. And there we go. So now we see our upstream trace. And again, we could have a calculation that could show us how many features in there. So when we look at trace configuration, so that's one reason you would want to do a trace configuration is just sharing within your organization. So if you had like a really complicated trace that took you a long time to configure, you may not want to do that every time. You could do a trace configuration, and then you could save that and share that with your organization. But the other reason is to use take advantage of the new widget. So in here, we'll go to our geoprocessing tools, and we'll just go to trace configuration. So this is done on the service as well. So you would input your utility network. You would give your trace configuration a name and a description and any tags. You would decide what type of trace you want. So if you did a downstream trace, you're going to pick your network, and you're going to pick your tier, your target tier. You're going to set these how you want them in any kind of traversability, filters, outputs. And then you're going to go ahead and hit run. And what that's going to do is it's going to save this trace configuration for you. And then as far as consuming that and publishing that, what you need to do is you actually need to publish a web map to ArcGIS Online. So here I have brought in my utility network. I have just a basic gray gray base map in here. And what I did for this purpose is that I actually created groupings in here for manhole channels, because it helps to group your, and I have a blog that I did on creating this. You can search for that. We'll put a link and send that out for the blog, showing you specifically how to group these and looking at the experience builder widget. But one thing that you have to make sure to do is you have to actually share your trace. So up here, oops, sorry. If you go and click this arrow and you go to sharing, these are two trace configurations that I have already created. So right now the upstream is checked. So if I wanted to do the downstream trace that I did, I would click OK. And then I would go ahead and share this to ArcGIS Online, because right now Portal does not have the trace widget in it. So it's a good idea to share this to ArcGIS Online. So I would just go ahead and I would publish my web map. I'm not going to do that now because I already have an example of that, but you would just go ahead and publish that, and it's going to contain your trace. And just looking really quick, final thing here. Here's Experience Builder. Basically, I brought in a web map, and then I have some text up here that I have dynamically linked to my data. And I have a controller down here, and I brought in the Utility Network Trace, and it will know if you have a web map that has a utility network in there. So this is basically just very simple widgets that are inside of here. And then published out, my trace looks like this. I can go ahead and click on that. I'm just going to zoom down here, and these are my trace configurations that I published. So I'm going to do an upstream trace. I'm going to click this to add my point. And then I'm going to go ahead and run. And so up here, you can see these are this is just a text widget that is connected, live connected into the data. So we've got 3 service connections that have been traced on there, and 1,000. And this is by just me summing. So you can do a lot of really cool things with the Experience Builder. So I summed the gravity main length there. You can also click on this and it gives you more of a breakdown of all of the different assets here. So you can change what's displayed. So something that was more relevant. So like maybe you want your asset ID instead.